The night my father told me I wasn't worth a dime. The rain was falling so hard it drowned out my mother's favorite wind chime. I remember every sound, every flicker of light on his glass of bourbon. His office smelled of oak and smoke, the same way it had my entire childhood, but that night it felt colder, like the scent itself had turned against me. "You're soft, Lena," he said, eyes not leaving the fire. "You always were. You read too much, think too much, care too much. That's not how you survive in business. Ethan gets that. He's the one who will keep this family name alive." I stood there, gripping the edge of the desk my mother had chosen. "Mom wanted us to share everything equally," I said. My voice sounded small even to me. "That's what she wrote in her will." He laughed, an ugly, hollow sound. "Your mother didn't understand how the world works. I've made some adjustments. Ethan's the heir. You'll be fine. Find a husband, travel, paint, do whatever it is sentimental girls like you do." The words sliced deeper than I expected. My mother had been gone barely a year, and here he was, rewriting her final wish as if her love were just another entry in a ledger. From the corner, Ethan leaned against the doorframe, smirking. "You can't fight him, Lena," he said quietly. "It's already done. The lawyers signed off today." I looked at him. The golden boy, the favorite, the one who had never been told he wasn't enough. I wanted to scream, to demand how he could let this happen. But instead I just turned toward the door. "Fine," I said. "Keep it all, but don't forget Mom loved me too. Love doesn't pay bills," my father said, and turned back to his fire. That was the last thing he said to me before I walked out of that house. The next few months blurred together cheap apartments, overworked nights, silent mornings. I took whatever jobs I could find, waitressing by day, studying accounting by night. The bitterness kept me alive. Every tip I earned, every dollar I saved, felt like a rebellion against the man who had told me I wasn't worth one. But grief has a way of settling into your bones. Some nights I'd sit on the floor of my tiny apartment, staring at old photographs of my mother, wondering if she'd somehow seen this coming. She had always told me, "Keep your records, Lena. Numbers don't lie even when people do." It was that memory that planted the first seed. A year later, I visited the county archives to find my mother's will. I don't know what I was expecting, closure, maybe, but what I found instead was a signature that didn't look like hers. The ink was too dark, the date mismatched the day she'd been hospitalized. I felt my heart race, something was wrong. I requested copies of the estate transfers, the bank statements, every transaction linked to her name. Most clerks wouldn't have noticed the inconsistencies, but I did. The money didn't go into my father's main business. It vanished into something called Hayes Family Trust No. 3, a shell company I'd never heard of. That night, I pinned the papers to my wall, one by one, until the wallpaper disappeared under the weight of lies. For the first time since he'd told me I wasn't worth a dime, I smiled, because maybe I wasn't, but I was worth a fight. Years slipped by like faded pages. While my father and Ethan thrived under the Hayes empire, I lived in the quiet corners of the city, working by day, studying by night, and never once letting the bitterness drown me. I wasn't planning revenge then, not yet. I was planning understanding, because the one thing my father never counted on was my patience. I graduated with a degree in finance and took a job as a junior accountant at a mid-tier auditing firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me access to the kind of information my father used to control everyone else's lives. Numbers became my language of truth. Every decimal held a story. Every missing figure whispered betrayal. It started small, just curiosity. I wanted to see if Hayes Family Trust No. 3, the shadow account I'd found after my mother's death, still existed. It did, and it wasn't alone. There were 6 other trusts, all filed under slightly different names, but connected by one familiar address, my father's private office. I began to trace transfers one by one. Some went to consultants, others to foundations, but when I followed the money trail, they all ended up in offshore accounts, many under my brother's name. Ethan wasn't just his heir, he was his shield. My father was laundering family money through him. I started keeping records, screenshots, emails, scanned statements, anything I could quietly get my hands on. I backed everything up 3 times, hidden under anonymous cloud storage accounts, I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but instinct told me to document everything. At night, I'd sit in my small apartment surrounded by stacks of papers, red thread connecting dates and accounts across my wall like veins of truth. Every line I drew gave me strength. For years, my father's voice had echoed in my head, "You're not worth a dime." But the numbers were proving otherwise. I was worth every cent he stole. Then, one evening, I discovered something that froze my blood. There was a transaction from my mother's personal savings dated 6 months before she died transferred to a shell corporation owned by Hayes Holdings. The note read temporary management, but the money never returned. That wasn't business, that was theft. My mother had trusted him even as her health failed, and he'd stolen from her before she was gone. My hands trembled as I read the figures again. All that talk about adjustments, about me being soft. It wasn't just cruelty. It was strategy. He'd been covering his tracks for years. I spent the next 2 years quietly building my arsenal. I requested old tax filings, obtained digital copies of company ledgers, even reached out to former employees under the guise of research. Each new document added another piece to the puzzle. By the time I turned 28, I had an archive large enough to bury an empire. Still, I told no one, not even friends. Secrets like these couldn't be shared. They had to be unveiled. Then, one morning at the firm, I received an internal memo. Hayes Holdings was being audited for routine compliance. I felt my pulse quicken. My father was vulnerable, and for the first time in years, I saw a way in. That night, as I stared at the tangled web of names and numbers covering my wall, I whispered into the quiet room, "You took everything from me, but I kept the receipts." The girl who once left home in tears was gone. In her place stood something sharper, steadier. The storm was coming. And this time I would be the one writing the ledger. 5 years had passed since I'd last seen my father, but stepping through the glass doors of Hayes Holdings felt like walking into a memory I'd tried to bury. The walls gleamed, the marble floors shone, and every face that glanced at me carried that same expression of quiet obedience I'd worn once. Nothing had changed except me. I had come back not as the wounded daughter he dismissed, but as the woman he created by underestimating. "Lena Hayes," he said when I entered his office, his tone clipped, guarded. "Didn't think I'd see you again. You always said I needed to toughen up," I replied lightly. "Consider this proof I took your advice." He studied me with a faint smirk, swirling the amber in his glass. "You look more like your mother every day," he said, almost absent-mindedly. She was stubborn too. That word stubborn had always been his way of saying disobedient. I smiled anyway. "I'm here to help," I said. "You mentioned at one point Ethan could use someone with a head for numbers. I've spent the last few years in finance. Thought maybe I could contribute." The lie slid out smoothly. I'd rehearsed it for months. He hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, you'll report to Ethan. He's handling a merger that needs a steady hand. Don't make me regret it." "I wouldn't dream of it," I said. Working under Ethan was worse than I expected. He strutted through the office like a prince born to rule, throwing commands and insults in equal measure. He thought I'd come crawling back for approval, but I was there for something far more valuable. The missing ledgers, the internal communications, the trail he didn't know he'd left. Each night, after everyone had gone home, I stayed behind balancing spreadsheets. In truth, I was copying files, scanning records, tracing every transaction that matched the offshore accounts I'd already uncovered. I had nearly everything I needed, but one last file eluded me, the encrypted audit logs from Hayes Holdings' private server. They were password, protected under my father's authority, so I waited. One evening, after a late board meeting, I offered to help. My father finished the quarterly report. He poured himself a drink and logged into his computer, muttering about the press and taxes. His phone buzzed, and he stepped out for a call. The moment the door closed, I moved. I plugged in a flash drive I disguised as a presentation tool. My fingers trembled as the screen mirrored the transfer. Encrypted files, hidden folders, financial statements that spelled out every illegal move they'd ever made. By the time he returned, I was back at my desk, calmly typing, Still here, he asked. Just finishing the numbers, I said, smiling. A week later, Ethan cornered me in the hallway. What are you doing here, Lena? His voice was sharp, almost panicked. Dad might buy this little good. Girl act, but I don't. Maybe I just miss the family, I said softly. He sneered, you don't belong here. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Funny, that's what you said before Dad stole Mom's inheritance. You remember that, don't you? The color drained from his face. I walked away before he could respond. That weekend, we sat around the dinner table for the first time in years. My father raised a glass. To family, he said, even the stubborn ones. The laughter that followed was sharp and hollow. I set down my fork. You'll want to enjoy that toast, I said quietly, because after tonight, things are going to change. Ethan frowned. What's that supposed to mean? I looked between them. My father, the king of lies, and the brother who'd helped him build his paper throne. It means, I said, smiling faintly, you taught me well. And as the room fell silent, I knew the storm had finally arrived. By the next morning, the first domino had already fallen. An anonymous envelope had arrived at the Financial Crimes Division containing hundreds of pages of evidence. Transactions, falsified audits, shell company registrations, even personal emails. The files I'd stolen from my father's computer had found their new home in the hands of investigators who had been circling Hayes Holdings for months. I didn't need to be there to see the chaos unfold. The headlines told the story for me. Hayes Holdings under investigation for fraud and tax evasion. Business empire collapses amid family scandal. By noon, the company's stock had plummeted. By evening, federal agents had raided the office. My father's perfect empire crumbled in a single day, just as carefully as I had planned over the years. I watched the live news in silence, my heart pounding not from joy, but from something heavier. The satisfaction of justice wasn't the thrill I imagined. It was quiet, solemn, and strangely sad. My mother's voice echoed in my mind, do the right thing even when it hurts. Still, I couldn't deny it. This was my victory. 2 days later, Ethan called me. His voice shook through the static. Lena, what did you do? Nothing, I said calmly. I just told the truth. They're freezing the accounts, Dad's losing everything, you've destroyed us. I almost laughed. Destroyed you? You destroyed Mom's legacy years ago when you helped him move her money offshore. There was silence on the line. Then quietly he said, you'll regret this. I already did. I replied and hung up. The lawsuit followed quickly. My lawyers filed a civil claim for theft of inheritance and financial fraud, backed by every document I'd gathered. It took months, but the truth was undeniable. My father's lawyers tried every defense, misunderstanding, business oversight, family dispute, but the numbers didn't lie. The court ruled in my favor. Half of what had been stolen from my mother's estate was legally restored to me, along with damages. Ethan was charged as an accessory, though he settled for cooperation. My father, once the untouchable patriarch of Hayes Holdings, was found guilty of multiple counts of fraud and tax evasion. The day the verdict was read, I didn't smile or gloat. I just exhaled. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed me, asking how it felt to bring down my own family. I looked at their flashing cameras and said simply, I didn't bring them down. I just brought the truth up. With the restitution money, I did something my father would never have imagined. I created the Hayes Hope Foundation, named after my mother, dedicated to funding scholarships for young women studying law and finance, women who, like me, had been told they weren't worth a dime. The first check I signed under that name felt like reclaiming a heartbeat I'd lost years ago. Weeks later, I returned to my childhood home, now empty, its walls stripped bare. The furniture was gone, the paintings removed, the echoes of our lives reduced to dust. I walked through the study where he'd once told me I wasn't good enough. The smell of smoke still lingered faintly in the wood. I whispered into the silence, you said I wasn't worth a dime, Dad. Turns out I was worth everything you couldn't buy integrity. I left the key on the table and stepped outside. The air was crisp, and the sun was rising over the old oak trees. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel angry. I just felt free.